Why vanilla can cost more than silver, pound for pound. There was a period, not long ago, where a pound of vanilla beans was worth more than a pound of silver. Not gold, silver. An actual precious metal, mined from the earth, sitting on a shelf next to a spice you can buy at almost any grocery store. That sentence sounds like it shouldn't be true. Vanilla is the flavor of birthday cake, of ice cream, of the default option when nothing more exciting comes to mind. It's the least exotic-sounding word in the entire spice aisle. And yet, for a stretch of time, it was one of the most expensive agricultural products on the planet.
By the end of this, you'll understand why, and you'll probably never look at a bottle of vanilla extract the same way again. Let's start with the plant itself, because the story doesn't begin with economics. It begins with a flower that refuses to cooperate. Vanilla comes from the seed pod of a specific orchid, native to Mexico. In its home environment, this orchid has a single natural pollinator, a particular species of bee found almost nowhere else on Earth.
When Europeans tried growing vanilla orchids elsewhere in the world, in places with better soil, better climate, better everything, the plants grew beautifully, they flowered beautifully, and they produced almost nothing. Without that one specific bee, the flowers simply weren't getting pollinated. Entire vanilla industries outside Mexico stalled for decades because of a species of insect nobody could transplant. Then, in 1841, on the French island of Réunion, a 12-year-old enslaved boy named Edmond Albius figured out something that had stumped botanists and plantation owners for years. He discovered a method to hand-pollinate the vanilla orchid using a simple technique involving a thin sliver of bamboo and a careful hand motion, done flower by flower, one at a time. His method worked. It still works today. Almost every vanilla orchid grown commercially anywhere in the world, nearly 2 centuries later, is still pollinated by hand, using a variation of a technique invented by a child. Here's the part that explains almost everything about vanilla's price. Each vanilla flower blooms for a single day. Not a week, not even a full 24 hours in practical terms. If a worker doesn't hand-pollinate that specific flower during its narrow window, it closes, and the opportunity is gone until the plant flowers again, if it flowers again at all that season. Multiply that by millions of flowers across thousands of small farms, and you start to understand why vanilla has never industrialized the way other crops have. There's no machine that replaces this. There's no shortcut. It's still, in the 21st century, one flower and one human hand at a time. There's a sobering coda to Edmond Albius's story worth pausing on. His technique went on to build an industry now worth billions of dollars annually, grown across multiple continents, sold in nearly every country on Earth. Albius himself saw almost none of it. He was freed a few years after his discovery, worked various jobs on the island, and died in poverty in his early 30s. The single most important breakthrough in the entire history of vanilla farming came from someone who never captured any of the wealth it eventually created. That alone would make vanilla expensive, but it's not even the biggest reason prices can spike the way they do. The bigger reason is geography. The overwhelming majority of the world's natural vanilla, somewhere around 80% depending on the year, comes from a single country, Madagascar. One island off the southeastern coast of Africa effectively controls the global supply of a spice used in kitchens on every continent. This creates an enormous amount of fragility hiding underneath something as ordinary as ice cream. In 2017, a powerful tropical cyclone named Inawo tore directly through Madagascar's primary vanilla growing region, right before harvest season. Vines were destroyed. Curing infrastructure was damaged. A huge portion of that year's crop was wiped out in a matter of days. Global vanilla buyers didn't have a backup source to pivot to. There wasn't a second Madagascar waiting in reserve. Prices didn't just rise, They exploded, climbing past $400 per kilogram, and in some market reports, briefly touching numbers in the range of $500 to $600 per kilogram. At that price point, vanilla wasn't just expensive. It was, gram for gram, worth more than silver. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because extreme scarcity doesn't just raise prices, it changes human behavior in ways nobody plans for. When a crop becomes worth more than a precious metal, it stops being treated like a crop. Vanilla theft became a serious, organized problem in Madagascar during these price spikes. Farmers, whose entire yearly income could be sitting unharvested in a field, started hiring armed guards to patrol their vanilla vines at night. Some began carving small identifying marks directly into the unripe green pods, still on the vine, essentially branding their crop the way you'd microchip something valuable, so a stolen pod could be traced back to a specific farm if it turned up for sale elsewhere.
Think about that for a second. A spice, something you'd casually shake into cookie batter, had become valuable enough that farming communities were treating individual pods on a vine the way a jeweler treats individual diamonds. But extreme prices create their own kind of gravity, and vanilla's story doesn't stop at the spike. It has a second act that most explanations leave out entirely.
When word spread that vanilla was suddenly worth more than silver, farmers across Madagascar and neighboring regions rushed to plant more vines, hoping to capture some of that windfall. Vanilla takes several years to mature before it produces usable pods, so this response wasn't immediate. But a few seasons later, all that new planting matured at once, flooding the market with far more vanilla than buyers actually needed. Prices collapsed. Not gradually. They fell by more than half within a couple of years, leaving many farmers who had invested heavily during the boom holding a crop worth a fraction of what it had been when they planted it. This is a pattern economists see across nearly every commodity that experiences a sudden price shock. A spike triggers overinvestment. Overinvestment triggers oversupply, and oversupply triggers a crash. This is the point where most explanations of vanilla pricing stop. Rare orchid, hand pollination, single country dependency, a natural disaster, armed guards protecting crops. It's already a strange enough story. But there's a twist hiding underneath all of it, and it might be the most important part. If vanilla is this expensive, this fragile, and this labor-intensive, how does nearly every mass-produced product on Earth still list vanilla flavor on the label at a price you'd never notice? The answer is that almost none of it is actually vanilla. The overwhelming majority of vanilla flavoring used in food production worldwide isn't extracted from a vanilla bean at all. It's a synthesized compound called vanillin, the specific molecule primarily responsible for vanilla's flavor, produced in a lab rather than a field. Vanillin can be synthesized from petrochemical byproducts, or in some processes, from lignin, a compound found in wood pulp left over from paper manufacturing. This synthetic version costs a tiny fraction of what real vanilla extract costs, and it can be produced at a scale and consistency that a hand-pollinated orchid flower simply never could.
So the real economic story isn't just about how expensive vanilla can get. It's about how the entire global food industry quietly built an escape hatch around that expense decades ago, almost entirely out of public view. Most people pouring a vanilla milkshake have never once tasted an actual vanilla bean. This creates a strange split market. On one side, a genuinely rare, labor-intensive, climate-vulnerable crop, grown almost entirely on one island, hand-pollinated flower by flower, occasionally worth more than precious metal. On the other side, a lab-synthesized molecule mimicking its flavor, produced cheaply and consistently, filling almost every product on a supermarket shelf that claims to be vanilla-flavored. Both of these markets exist simultaneously, largely disconnected from each other, and most consumers never realize which one they're actually buying from. A grocery store shelf can sit a $12 bottle of pure vanilla extract right next to a $2 bottle labeled imitation vanilla.
And most shoppers, understandably, have no real way to judge whether that price gap reflects a meaningful flavor difference or just which side of this split market they happen to be looking at. Food manufacturers know this distinction intimately because it directly affects their margins at a massive scale. A company producing millions of units of vanilla ice cream simply cannot expose itself to a supply chain where the core ingredient might triple in price after a single storm. Vanillin solves that problem completely. It's stable, scalable, and immune to weather in Madagascar. The trade-off is a flavor that chemists and trained tasters can often distinguish from the real thing, even if most casual consumers can't. There's a broader pattern worth pulling out of this, because it doesn't just apply to vanilla. Whenever an agricultural product depends on a single region, a fragile growing process, and almost no viable substitutes at the point of production, that product becomes structurally exposed to sudden, extreme price swings. One cyclone, one bad season, one disruption to a single island's harvest, and a global commodity price can move more in a few months than most financial assets move in years. Chocolate faces a similar geographic concentration risk, with cocoa production centered heavily in West Africa. Certain rare coffee varieties face nearly identical single-region exposure. The pattern isn't unique to vanilla. Vanilla is just one of the clearest, strangest examples of it, because the price swings have been so extreme and so visible. What makes vanilla particularly instructive is how many separate points of fragility stack on top of each other in a single supply chain. A pollination window measured in hours, a labor process that has never been meaningfully automated in nearly 2 centuries, a supply concentrated on one island prone to cyclones, a crop that takes years to mature, meaning supply can't quickly respond to price signals the way a factory could ramp up production, and a boom-bust planting cycle that turns farmers' own reasonable decisions into the mechanism that eventually crashes their income. Most consumers never see any of this. They see a small bottle on a shelf, priced somewhere between an ordinary spice and a minor luxury, and assume the price reflects some fixed, stable cost of production. In reality, that bottle sits at the end of one of the most volatile, disaster-prone, labor-intensive supply chains in the entire global food system, and its price at any given moment depends heavily on how recently a storm has passed through one specific part of the world. So, the next time you see natural vanilla flavor on a label, priced only slightly higher than the artificial version beside it, you're looking at the edge of an entire global supply chain, balanced on a single flower that blooms for one day, on farms guarded at night, on an island that grows most of the world's supply of something that briefly outpriced silver. And the next time the label just says vanilla flavor, with no natural in front of it, you're most likely not tasting vanilla at all. You're tasting a molecule built in a lab to imitate a flower that a 12-year-old boy figured out how to pollinate by hand nearly 200 years ago, using nothing but a sliver of bamboo.